Good evening, everybody, and welcome again. I think most of you know who I am, Sister Maria Piscuzzi. I'm the director of Spirit Alive, which, as I've told you many times, is made possible through your generous donations and the support of the Sisters of St. Joseph and a RASCOBE grant. So I just want to remind you of a couple of things. We tape every one of these presentations, so if you miss it, and you're not here to hear this announcement, but you will when you do the recording or you write to me, you can see the recording. Please wait 72 hours until it gets edited and put up. Or if there was something interesting tonight that you'd like to listen to again, please do so. If you have a little audio trouble, if you look on your screen bottom, you see the CC box for captions. So you'll see a transcript of what Tom is saying, or if you're on an iPad, I think it would be on the upper part of your screen. So in a few minutes, Tom is going to start, and he'll be with us for about 50 or 55 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A period. As always, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box, and then when we get to them, either and if you don't want to do that, you can be called on if you raise your hand at the end of the session, and Tom will answer your question. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce a good friend of mine, Tom Rzeznik, who completed his doctorate in history at the University of Notre Dame in 2006. Since then, he's been a professor, soon to be, I hope, a full professor of history at Seton Hall University in South Orange, New Jersey, where we met. Tom is the author or editor of 3 books and the co-editor of the quarterly journal, the American Catholic Studies, one of the most prestigious journals in the field. He has published over 20 scholarly articles and essays in some of the top scholarly journals in his field. He specializes in American religious history with a particular interest in the history of the Catholic community in the United States. I noticed when reading his writings, he even has one on healthcare in the Brooklyn Diocese, which I'm going to go back and read when I get time. He enjoys teaching classes also in urban history and environmental history. Tom was honored with the inaugural Robert F. Triscoe and Nelson A. Minnick Prize by the American Catholic Historical Association for his exceptional role as the co-editor of the journal American Catholic Studies. Tom, along with an accomplished colleague in the theology department, is also the recipient of a Lilly Grant working on, quote, medical humanities, pedagogy, and praxis. I am delighted that Tom agreed to do this course and take time out of his busy teaching and research schedule to be with us. He'll give you a little bit more detail about my conversation, but my request to him for this course grew out of my growing recognition of how entirely ignorant I was about American church history, apart from what I learned in grade school, which was heavily skewed in the direction of the Jesuits, Father Marquette and Joliet, the North American Martyrs, and the Franciscans led by Junipero Serra, converting the indigenous populations and bringing light and truth to the nation. It's a bit more complicated than that, as I've learned in subsequent reading and talking to Tom, and I'm grateful that Tom is with us tonight. In addition to everything else I said about him, I want you to know Tom is a great guy and was a wonderful colleague during my tenure at Seton Hall, and I enjoyed many evenings at his home with other colleagues complaining. So Tom, take it away and welcome. Please.
Sure. Thank you. I was just getting the PowerPoint slides up, and hopefully people will be able to see that in just a second. Okay, so that should be coming through. So greetings, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you and to have this opportunity to share some reflections on the American Catholic story. I want to begin by extending my thanks to Sister Maria and the Sisters of St. Joseph of Brentwood for the invitation to offer this mini course. As Sister Maria noted, I'm an associate professor of history at Seton Hall University in South Orange, and I regularly teach classes on American Catholic history and American religious history. So it's really great to have the opportunity to share some of those classroom lessons with a wider audience. And as Sister Maria also noted, for the past 12 years, I've served as co-editor of the quarterly journal American Catholic Studies. So I owe a great debt to all those who have contributed to the journal over the years. Their scholarship has very much informed the way that I think about American Catholic history. It also demonstrates how scholars ask new questions, add to our knowledge, and challenge us to rethink assumptions. I will do my best throughout the series to give appropriate credit to those whose research has shaped my own understanding. And the title of the journal itself reflects how the field itself has changed over the years. In the past few decades, it's moved from an older model of church history, which often focused on institutional narratives and narratives that privileged official accounts and official actors, and has moved to a more interdisciplinary approach, religious history, Catholic studies, approaches that look at popular practice and recognize the diversity of the American Catholic experience. As a way of thinking about the course, I wanted to say a little bit about the theme for the series. We've called it American Catholic History, Telling the Story Anew. The focus on story was intentional. As I tell my students, history is not just a list of names and dates, or a mere chronicle of the past. History is a narrative, or more properly, a collection of narratives. It's the stories that we tell. It's the stories that we choose to tell, or the ones that we need to tell. They are stories with meaning and purpose. We highlight certain figures or events because they're meaningful to us. And over time, some stories may recede, while others gain new salience. At the same time, new evidence can force us to reassess some of our existing narratives. And we all have historical narratives in our head. We fit new information and stories into existing frameworks. And we also inherit narratives. To give you just one example here, this is a copy of a book that I have sitting on my shelves, The Triumph of Faith. It was a popular Catholic high school textbook. This is the second edition from 1958 that combines theology and history and provides one example of how the Catholic story was told in the past through the lens of church history and salvation history, one that captures the Catholic triumphalism of the era. So I hope that this series encourages us to think a little bit more about how we tell the story now. As we move through the next couple of weeks, we're going to be mindful of both existing narratives and how those narratives have changed. I also hope that the series will give us an opportunity to explore some of the ways that recent historical scholarship has contributed to a richer and more complex understanding of U.S. Catholic history, including confronting some of the more challenging realities of the past. And I hope that this will also encourage us to consider how the stories that we tell can serve the Church's ongoing mission today. As an outline for the series, this is just a quick overview for the topics of each of our 5 sessions. We're going to begin this evening with American foundations. We'll look at how the Church's origin story has developed from the early development in the New World. Next week, we're going to turn to the immigrant church. This is a narrative that will be familiar to many. Catholicism in the United States has been a faith shaped by the immigrant experience. But that wasn't always something that the Church embraced. Why? How did that change? Week 3 will focus on brick and mortar Catholicism. It's going to focus on the building up of the Church's institutional presence, from parishes and schools to social welfare institutions. How did that all come about, and what's its legacy? The fourth session focuses on mid-century modern. It'll look at the emergence of a modern U.S. Catholicism in the mid-20th century, an era of unparalleled Catholic strength and confidence. But what tensions were simmering below the surface? And then finally, we'll look at Americanism revisited. We will revisit debates over Americanism and Americanization, and how some of the issues of the Americanist crisis of the early 20th century look today. But for this evening, let's focus on origin stories. Who doesn't love a good origin story? Where does American Catholic history begin? Not surprisingly, many accounts of US history start off with Christopher Columbus and his voyages of discovery. We all know that in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Catholics were especially keen to celebrate Columbus. Well before Columbus became a focus of Italian-American pride, Catholics were determined to tell his story. Case in point. In 1880, Father Edward Sorin, a French-born missionary priest and founder of the University of Notre Dame, commissioned an Italian artist, Luigi Gregori, who had previously served as artist in residence at the Vatican, to paint a series of 12 murals to adorn the walls of the first-floor hallways of the university's main building, which was being rebuilt after a devastating fire in 1879. Completed between 1881 and 1884, Gregori's panels depicted the story of Columbus, from his meeting with Queen Isabella of Spain and his departure, to his landing in the New World and taking possession of that land in the name of Spain, on through to his return to Spain and his death in 1506. But why would a French-born missionary priest at a school in Indiana choose to focus on Columbus? Why not the French missionaries? In part, Father Sorin was seeking to shape the historical narrative. In choosing to honor Columbus, he wanted to shift focus away from the Pilgrims, Puritans, and other English colonists whose story often featured prominently in American history books. Sorin and other Catholics of his generation looked to create an alternative origin story for the United States, one that demonstrated Catholics' contributions to the nation and their enduring presence. The story of Columbus allowed them to show not only that Catholics were here from the very beginning, but to boast that Catholics were responsible for the development of the New World and, by extension, the United States. Father Sorin wanted to shape his students' understanding of the past, their past, and the nation's past. He was engaged in an effort to chronicle the history of a Catholic America and reframe the history of the United States. In short, he was trying to rewrite the history books, using art as a teaching tool. And just as a side note, at the same time as Father Sorin is developing these Columbus murals, the Knights of Columbus were founded in New Haven, Connecticut in 1882. The Knights had intentionally chosen Columbus as their model and their namesake, thinking that he would serve as a figure who could unite American Catholics across ethnic boundaries. Columbus's story reminds us that the story of US Catholicism did not begin with the English colonies. Yes, the first Catholic diocese in the United States was founded in Baltimore in 1789, but it was a relative latecomer. The oldest, quote, American diocese was San Juan, Puerto Rico, established in 1511. The Diocese of Quebec was founded in 1674. And New Orleans was established in 1793, just a couple years after Baltimore. Missionary activity goes back even further. The missions at St. Augustine, Florida, were established in 1587. The first missions in New Mexico date to 1598. And the oldest church building in the United States is San Miguel Mission in Santa Fe, New Mexico. In short, US Catholicism predated the establishment of the British colonies. And as historian Mara Jane Farley has reminded us, quote, "The Catholic Church in America began in a Southern context." That basic truth affects our narrative and our sense of the Church's American development. Accounts often plot the development of Catholicism alongside the development of the United States, moving from east to west. But as the US Church spread westward, it was not the first to plant Catholicism in those regions. Rather, as the US Church moved westward, it would encounter long-standing Catholic communities when it reached into the American Southwest, the Upper Midwest, or Pacific Northwest. There were multiple American Catholicisms, multiple points of origin that emerged during this colonial era, and that would continue to develop in their own distinct ways. And how those distinct Catholic cultures would come together is a complex story, and one that we're going to look at in a future session. Going back to Notre Dame for a minute, there's an added twist to the story of the murals. A twist that reminds us how narratives change. In 2017, the university's student newspaper published a letter to the editor signed by more than 300 students, faculty, and alumni calling for the murals to be removed. They argued that Columbus is not a figure the university should be honoring, given what we now know about the history of brutality and forced enslavement. Quote, "The native persons are depicted as stereotypes, their destruction is gilded over, and their slavery is celebrated," the letter said of the artwork. So what to do? Ultimately, the university decided to place a cover over the murals and add an explanatory note for visitors. They occasionally uncover the murals for educational purposes. There was some call for the murals to be removed, but since they were sort of part of the wall, that was hard to do. So they covered over them in this particular way. And so this little episode sort of reminds us how history changes. Stories that were once celebrated and meaningful become problematic. What do we do? What do we do with uncomfortable history? Do we cover it up? How do we balance different perspectives? And so this is part of the ongoing challenge of reinterpreting the American Catholic story. Turning our attention to the development of the church in the United States, some of these same tensions spill over, some of these tensions over narrative and memory spill over when we look at the missionary era and the stories of those who first worked to build up the American church. Without doubt, the church owes a great debt to these missionaries. Catholic texts often call attention to their profound faith and heroic determination to spread the gospel and evangelize native peoples. Theirs was the great work of bringing new souls into the church. The tales were often heroic. These were Catholic superheroes. They were praised for their selflessness and willingness to endure suffering. And just yesterday, Pope Francis paved the way for the beatification of the Georgia martyrs, 5 Spanish Franciscans who were killed by a young indigenous man who was heir to the local chiefdom. He had the Franciscans killed after they had told him that he, as a Christian, could not take a second wife. The martyrs, the Georgia martyrs, have been praised for their readiness to give their lives to the Lord and their willingness in accepting to be sent off to the missions. The bishop who first promoted their cause, a guy by the name of Augustin Verreau, wrote in a pastoral letter of 1858. He talked about how Florida was blessed by the, quote, purest blood of the martyrs. Varro mistakenly believed that the site of their martyrdom was in Florida, when in fact it was in Georgia. But that point notwithstanding, his sentiments reflect the way that these martyrs were seen as sanctifying American lands. It was a call for others to follow their example. Stories how missionaries, kind of transformed American society continue in other ways. Scholars have pointed to their creative work in evangelizing, how they learned native languages, how they lived peacefully with native peoples. Recent scholarship has talked about the work of art, music, and liturgy as a way of communicating the faith. These early missionaries have also been praised in their efforts for enculturation. One American historian, not writing in terms of Catholic history, but just early American history, has praised the Jesuit missionaries in New France as being among the few who, quote, truly saw the Indians, saw them more fully than other white colonists ever did. And he praised them for a genuine transcultural encounter. And we have some remarkable accounts, including the one image that you see to the right of your screen is a copy of the Jesuit Relations. These were a set of chronicles from 1632 to 1673, which provide remarkably rich details about the Jesuit missions in New France. They were written as reports back to France to chronicle the Jesuit labors, but also to solicit ongoing support, both in terms of money and manpower. And the records, these Jesuit relations, provide some of the best accounts we have of native societies of the time, admittedly filtered through a European lens. But it shows how the Jesuits were very much willing to learn about native cultures and sort of functioned like anthropologists. And I should also note that these early missionaries were not just men, but recent works in Catholic history have also called attention to the contributions of women religious, especially in French mission territories. In a book called Masterless Mistresses, historian Emily Clark reveals how the Ursulines came to the New World in 1727 from France with a desire to be missionaries and to aid in the work of evangelization. They were soon called upon to provide critical social services, nursing, and education that helped the colony thrive. Their school, the Ursuline Academy in New Orleans, founded in 1727, is the oldest all-girls school in the United States. And similar work has been done on the Ursulines in California. For those who may think about the Spanish missions, perhaps the most famous example are the California missions. These were among the last of the Spanish missions to develop. The first, in San Diego, was founded in 1769, more than 200 years after the founding of St. Augustine, Florida. The figure at the center of these California missions was Junipero Serra. He was born in 1713 on the island of Majorca, off the coast of Spain in the Mediterranean. He entered the Franciscan seminary at age 16 and was ordained 7 years later. In the seminary, he was a standout student and was soon tapped to be a professor. He easily could have stayed there and enjoyed a distinguished career, but he was yearning for something more. He desired to join his brother Franciscans in the missions in the New World. So at age 35, which was considered rather old to be a missionary, he requests to be sent to the New World. Was it a spiritual quest? A midlife crisis? Either way, I like to think of him as a second career missionary. After working in Mexico for several years, helping to rekindle devotion among those who had already been evangelized, he accepted an appointment to establish missions in what was known as Alta California, the area we now know as California, an area that had not been previously served by missionaries. The field of labor was new, and Sarah took delight in the prospects of being one of the first to bring the gospel to these new lands and new peoples. He would be both a missionary and a pioneer. And he took particular sort of joy in baptizing native peoples. He took detailed records recording the number of baptisms that he performed, because for him, that was the way that you were bringing new souls into the church. He began the task of establishing the California missions in his mid-50s. And he was responsible for establishing 9 of the California missions by the time of his death in 1784. Sarah was known for his asceticism and his willingness to endure suffering for the sake of the missions. Shortly after his arrival in New Spain, he was bitten by an insect, and the wound ulcerated and refused to heal. The injury would stay with him for the rest of his career. Still, he refused animal transport and insisted on walking, clocking thousands of miles as he moved up and down the coast of California. Sarah was also incredibly good at his job. Not only was his heart in the right place, committed to the missions and evangelization, but he was also a good manager. He was a master at writing long, detailed memoranda, negotiating with royal officials, ensuring that the missions had the supplies they needed, and defending the work of the Franciscans. These reports are one of the reasons we know so much about Sarah and the California missions. But how do we now think about Sarah and his legacy? Catholics have often painted the missions and the missionaries in glowing terms. As I mentioned already, it's filled with heroic narratives. And some of these stories were told over time, not just by Catholics, but also those in California who celebrated the Franciscans as part of their cultural heritage, especially in the early 20th century as part of the tourist trade, trying to draw people to Southern California. But we now know that the Spanish missions have a very contested legacy. Some of it is rooted back to church teachings, like the doctrine of discovery, which enabled the Spain and Portugal to claim New World territories that were not ruled over by Christians. And so the doctrine of discovery gave them a right to the land if they promised to convert the native peoples. At the same time, the missionaries were often vocal in their defense of indigenous people, trying to protect them from exploitation, from enslavement, from other abuses at the hands of royal officials and conquistadors. We now recognize that the missions were part of an imperial project and not simply spiritual evangelization. The missions expected native peoples not just to be Christianized, but also to be Hispanicized, to be turned into Spanish subjects. It involved remaking peoples. Once you entered the mission and converted, you were making a commitment to live a Christian life. This placed you under the mission's spiritual and ecclesiastical control. It also meant a radical break with your past. And the missions were known for exacting punishment upon those who sought to run away and return to their native villages, or those who sought to return to native religious practices. Some of these tensions over the missions resurfaced recently when Pope Francis in 2015 canonized Sarah. To critics, Sarah was a cultural imperialist, one who forcibly imposed European religion and culture upon native peoples, erasing their cultural heritage. And so when looked in that way, kind of the missions become sites of genocide, cultural genocide in terms of erasing native practices, but also at times also sites of physical genocide, given the amount of disease that often spread within these missions. As one historian has written, kind of death stalked the California missions. But as we think about this story, there's that story of imperialism, but there's also a story of faith that needs to be recognized. And here I want to just quickly call attention to Andrew Galvin, who is the curator of Mission Dolores in San Francisco. Earlier in 2024, sort of a year ago in January 2024, the American Catholic Historical Association had its annual convention in San Francisco. While there, we were treated to a tour of Mission Dolores, led by Andy Galvin. He himself, in his work as curator, chooses to honor Sarah. He had been working with the Franciscans since 1978 on Sarah's cause for canonization. And Galvin believes that Sarah lived a holy life. He believes Sarah expressed a genuine love for Native peoples and protected them from the abuses of Spanish officials, soldiers, and others. Scholars of Sarah have noted that Sarah once journeyed to Mexico City to demand justice for two Native women who had been raped by a Spanish soldier. Sarah also asked for mercy for a group of Native men awaiting execution for killing a priest. Galvin hopes that Sarah's canonization will promote discussion and outreach. And it reminds us that it's often difficult to disentangle colonization from evangelization. In his role as curator of Mission Dolores, a position that he has held since 2004, Galvin has also worked to retell the story of the mission to include its indigenous history. In his presentation to us back in January 2024, Galvin mentioned that one of his frustrations is hearing somebody say, the Franciscans built the mission. They established it, yes, but indigenous peoples provided the labor, some of it forced. Galvin noted how some of the construction techniques and decorative patterns used in the mission church reflect indigenous styles. For Galvin, this work is not just professional, but also personal. He himself is of Native ancestry, and the mission is where his own ancestors became Christian. One of his ancestors was baptized in the mission in 1801, and that ancestor's parents were buried in the mission cemetery, along with some 5,700 other indigenous people in unmarked graves. One of Galvin's goals has been to erect a memorial to the indigenous dead who were buried at Mission Dolores. His goal is to give recognition to their lives and their contributions. He mentioned that his goal is not to change history, but to qualify it, to give Native peoples their proper place within the context of the mission. And so in hearing that example, it was a kind of a very vivid reminder of how Native peoples were not just those who were evangelized, but also those who helped to build up the church in the New World. They deserve recognition as founding figures as well. Switching gears back to the East Coast, I want to sort of conclude this session with discussion of the English colonies and what we now know. Many of you will be familiar that Maryland has a prominent role in the history of U.S. Catholicism. It served as a haven for Catholics in British North America and later became home to the first diocese in the United States, Baltimore, established in 1789. At the founding of that diocese, the territory covered the entire country, from Maine to Georgia, from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River. The first Catholic colonists arrived in 1634, carried from England aboard two ships, the Ark and the Dove, which had been hired by Cecil Calvert, the first Lord Baltimore, whose father had established the Maryland colony. The ships landed on St. Clement's Island on the Potomac River. The Maryland Act of Toleration granted freedom of conscience to those who professed a belief in a Trinitarian faith. The map to your right shows some of those Jesuit mission statements. St. Mary's City is located down towards the bottom. And then sort of towards the north, you can see Georgetown and Washington, D.C. The other image is St. Francis Xavier Shrine and Cemetery, known as Old Bohemia. And that image comes from 2014, the 300th anniversary of that location. Old Bohemia was one of the sites of the early Jesuit missions, the mission plantations in the New World. The Jesuits, in order to support their ministry in the New World, were dependent on these plantations. The crops that they produced helped fund the Jesuits and their ministry. Those early churches were also sort of mission stations for the Jesuits, who traveled around the region visiting Catholic families in order to celebrate the sacraments. And so this story of the Jesuit missions in the British North America has certainly been a part of the celebrated history of Catholicism in the United States. But recently, some of these accounts have been broadened to rethink the origins of American Catholicism and those who contributed to it. And here in particular, Sister Maria alluded to the book that got us talking about this mini course and the need to rethink the narrative of American Catholic history. The 272. This is a book by journalist Rachel Swarns, and the subtitle is "The Families Who Were Enslaved and Sold to Build the American Catholic Church." The book looks at the 272 enslaved individuals who were sold by the Jesuits in Maryland in 1838 to help generate money to support Georgetown University and pay down its debts. The Jesuits secured $115,000 from the sale, which is the equivalent about $2.8 million today. The money not only helped to save Georgetown, but it also helped the Jesuits stabilize their own precarious finances and to expand their ministry to other areas, including sending Jesuits to places like New York City and other cities where they established schools and parishes. So some of those ministries also owe a debt to the 272 and the sale. As Swarns writes, quote, "For more than a century, the American Catholic Church relied on the buying, selling, and enslavement of Black people to lay its foundations, support its clergy, and drive its expansion. Without the enslaved, the Catholic Church in the United States, as we know it today, would not exist." So the book sort of covers not just the slave sale, but the early history of Jesuit slaveholding. The Jesuits in Maryland had been slaveholders since the colonial era. They relied on enslaved labor to work the plantations, and by the mid-1700s, the Jesuits were among the largest enslavers in Maryland. Swarns' work explores not only the Jesuit actions and how they wrestled with the decision to sell, especially after promising to keep families together, but the book also focuses on the enslaved individuals themselves, their families. A key figure who starts the book is a woman by the name of Anne Joyce, who arrived in Maryland sometime around 1676 as an indentured servant. Her indentured papers were intentionally destroyed by her employer, an act that, quote, "stole her freedom and forced her into slavery." Several of her descendants, many of them part of the Mahoney family, would be among those who were enslaved by the Jesuits. And yet, they remained Catholic. In the early 20th century, several members of the Mahoney family, descendants of one enslaved woman, Louisa, who remained with the Jesuits after the sale. Members of her family later moved to Woodstock, Maryland, where they continued to work for the Jesuits at their seminary there. At least 2 women from the Mahoney family became Catholic sisters. As Sworns writes, newly freed members of the Mahoney family have been, quote, who had been, quote, betrayed by the Catholic Church, but they did not abandon the Catholic faith that had sustained them during the darkest times. The accounts that Sworns tells can be haunting and heart-wrenching. And by the way, here is a copy of the sale from 1838. This was a document found in the Maryland Province Archives, now held by Georgetown University. But we also have other documentation. This is a copy of a letter from Thomas Brown, who was an enslaved man who had been taken by the Jesuits from Maryland to St. Louis when the Jesuits expanded their ministry into that city. In 1833, he writes a letter seeking to purchase his freedom, both his own and that of his wife. In his letter, Brown noted their poor treatment and how they were forced to live in an unheated outbuilding where, quote, now we have not a place to lay our heads in our old age after our years of service. So these sorts of accounts make Sworns's book incredibly powerful. But it's also a difficult book because it forces us to reconsider the church's early history and the legacy of the missionaries who are considered the Catholic Church's founding fathers. If anybody's interested in hearing more about the book, Sworns herself has given multiple talks on her work, many of which are recorded and available on YouTube, so you can tune in and hear her present more about this history. One thing about Sworns's book, it wasn't designed to be an expose, like the revelations of the sex abuse crisis or other scandals. The basic story of the sale was already known by the public by the time she wrote. Rather, the book was meant to be a reckoning. It was intended to make the story more widely known and to encourage readers, Catholics especially, to wrestle with this uncomfortable history, but also to promote reconciliation and reparation. Many of the records that Sworns and other scholars have used have now been digitized and made publicly available online. The Jesuits have established the Slavery, History, Memory, and Reconciliation Project. In response to the revelations about the 272, the Jesuits also agreed to raise $100 million to atone for the order's participation in slavery. And they're not alone. The Jesuits are not alone in confronting this aspect of their history. Other religious orders in the United States also held enslaved persons, including the Ursulines in New Orleans and the Sisters of Loretto in Kentucky. Some of the early members of that religious community brought enslaved persons with them into the community as part of their dowry. And these communities have been also engaged in this process of memory and reconciliation. To give you just a few examples of how religious communities have been honoring the past, the Jesuits have been involved in a large-scale memory and reconciliation project, but we also see sort of smaller tributes and memorials. The Sisters of Loretto at the foot of the cross in Kentucky have since 2022 been engaged in the Loretto Roots Enslavement Project to research the lives of the individuals and families that had been enslaved, and they placed a memorial on their grounds. The Sisters of Charity Federation has put together a museum exhibit talking about their own community's history and involvement with slavery. And the lower image is a memorial by the Sisters of Charity of Nazareth, Kentucky. These episodes remind us not just of the church's involvement in and profit from slaveholding, but also to the ways that the Catholic Church in the United States accommodated itself and was perhaps tainted by chattel slavery and American understandings of race. And to give you sort of another dimension to this story about how the American Catholic story has been tainted by American notions of race, we can look at how religious communities have also worked to recover some of their own origin stories. And one of the most prominent ones is the story of Mother Teresa Maxis Duchemin, who was the founder of the IHM Sisters. The Sisters of the Immaculate Heart of Mary have recovered the story of one of their founders. Before establishing the IHMs, Mother Teresa was the child of, before establishing the IHMs, Mother Maxis had been one of the founding members of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, the first community of Black sisters in the United States, founded by Mother Mary Lang in 1829. Mother Teresa Maxis was herself of mixed race. Her father was British. Her mother was of Haitian, Black Haitian origin. Given Duchemin's mixed racial status, the IHMs had whitewashed their history for 160 years, fearing that having their founding associated with a Black woman would prove, quote, embarrassing and unpleasant, and might deter vocations. Much of the credit to recovering Duchemin's story is owed to members of the IHM community themselves, including Sister Margaret M, who worked to recover Duchemin's story and to correct the historical narrative. In 1992, Gannon published a collection of letters that documented Duchemin's foundational role within the community and cemented her status as one of the founders of the IHMs. And Duchemin's story is also a reminder how race could be used to exclude individuals from the Catholic story. It was also used as a way to exclude vocations. Recently, historian Shannon D. Williams has documented much of this story in her book, Subversive Habits: Black Catholic Nuns and the Long African-American Freedom Struggle. Dr. Williams's book looks at how many religious orders turned away Black candidates and tells the story of those who persevered in their vocations and worked to desegregate religious life. This included many Black women who were often educated by white religious orders who then sought admission to those same communities, but they were sometimes directed towards Black religious congregations or simply turned away, in a way having their religious vocation questioned or denied. So it's really about this remarkable story of persistence and the role Black women played, not just in desegregating religious orders, but helping build up the Catholic Church in the United States. So we as historians and as a Catholic community need to better acknowledge the longstanding presence and enduring witness of Black Catholics that can be traced all the way back to the colonial era through the stories of enslaved individuals and others who were equally pioneering in their faith and helped to build up the church in the United States. And here we can look at the work that's being done by those who are actively engaged in promoting a group that has come to be known as the Saintly Six, Black Catholics on the path towards sainthood. And these include individuals whose story can be traced back to the colonial period and the early republic in the United States. They include the Venerable Pierre Toussaint, who was born into slavery in Haiti and was brought to New York City by his enslavers and later freed upon their death. A successful hairdresser and barber, he became a prominent benefactor of the early Catholic Church in New York City, including helping to raise funds for the first St. Patrick's Cathedral and the Catholic orphanages in the city. They include Venerable Mother Mary Lang, the founder of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, the first religious community for Black women in the United States. They persevered even though their vocation was questioned for those who could not imagine Black women as Catholic sisters. We have the Venerable Henriette DeLille, the founder of the Sisters of the Holy Family in New Orleans. We have Venerable Augustus Tolton, the first Black priest in the United States. He was born into slavery. He had to go to Europe to receive his training since no American seminary would accept him. We have Servant of God, Julia Greeley, a formerly enslaved woman known for her humble charity, and Servant of God, Sister Teresa Bowman, who called on the church to recognize the gifts of Blackness. These are all part of the story of Catholicism in the United States. By way of conclusion, I just want to end with a few points and sort of reminders, and perhaps some of the takeaways from this first session. First, we need to recognize the multiple origin stories for American Catholicism. It's not simply the English, and it's not simply the missionaries themselves. We need to broaden out our our cast of characters. The first Catholics were not just Spanish friars or persecuted English Catholics. They were enslaved individuals brought to the New World. They were also native peoples who were converted to the faith. They often persisted in their faith, leading to enduring communities of faith that would outlast those original missions. We also need to acknowledge some of the wounds that have been inflicted. Moments of celebration for some might need to be nuanced. These stories are also a reminder about how history can serve as a path towards healing and reconciliation. And it's a call for all of us who work in the field of Catholic history, but also those of us who tell the Catholic story, whether as journalists or engaged in pastoral ministry, to strive for more inclusive narratives that really do try to tell the story of all American Catholics who have contributed to building up the church in the United States. The stories that we tell have not just historical implications, but also ecclesiastical and pastoral implications. And so I hope that we can all sort of leave this session thinking about ways that we can begin to internalize some of these stories and make them part of our collective understanding of the past and the way that we all work to tell the story of American Catholicism. So with that, I will open the door to any questions that any of you might have. Please take advantage of the chat feature. And I think that Sister Maria might be helping to moderate some of these questions. And if you're not comfortable with the chat, you can always raise your hand and our tech support will help bring you in. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom. That was wonderful. While people are gathering their thoughts together, I was thinking, when I read that book, the 272 that Tom mentioned, I was kind of appalled at the Jesuits. I know the Jesuits from my studies in Rome. I know the Jesuits as these great social activists. So it was startling to read it and realize, again, as I said, how ignorant I was. And also, if you read that book, even sometimes the complicity of Rome in allowing the Jesuits to do what they did. But tonight, I think, for me, as a religious woman, what struck me is our own, I don't know, I can't say, I've been in the community 55 years, so I would say at least our own passive racist past. We don't have Black Sisters of St. Joseph of Brentwood, not now anyway. There may have been some in the past and others who are older than I am that are here. But I've always wondered why we've lived in one of the most diverse cities in the world, um, with such a large immigrant, Black and other population, and we remain as we are. And it makes me think that before I throw any stones at the Jesuits of Maryland, I should think about our own situation. But that's just a little comment. Steve Henry has his hand raised. So, Steve, you want to unmute and take over? Steve, if you can hear me, can you unmute? Matthew, can you help Steve unmute?
I am prompting him to unmute. I think here he is.
Yeah.
Yes,
Steve?
thank you for your presentation, Tom, and thank you, sister. Yes, I read both the books that you mentioned, the latter books. One of the things I was kind of appalled at that basically, the religious orders, the Jesuits and the sisters, and I have relatives in the sisters too, that go back into the 1800s. That they just didn't allow people of either indigenous or Black people to be people who would become priests or religious in their orders. I'm kind of appalled by that,
Mhm. And for some, it led to kind of very difficult situations, not just in this early history, but later on when we get to the post-Civil War and Jim Crow segregation, that for some orders, kind of being able to accept colored vocations became difficult. To accept Black vocations would then potentially mean that religious communities had to kind of within a convent integrate, and that could be sort of really disruptive to social norms. So it sort of shows how kind of part of it is internal to the religious community, how they themselves have to sort of contend with their own racism, but also to contend with sort of external factors like civil law and what that might mean. Catherine Drexel, who was very well known for establishing the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament that worked to evangelize Black communities, she was reluctant to accept Black vocations into her religious order, even though it was part of their founding mission to evangelize the colored population. And, part of it was strategic, that having a sort of a mixed, sort of an integrated community would pose problems. So I think all of this sort of, it's functions at the local level, as Sister Maria mentioned. It's also kind of a transnational story. The Jesuits are weighing this decision also in terms of how Rome and the Vatican is thinking about slavery and the slave trade by the time we get to 1838. And so to some extent, the Jesuits at the time were also trying to free themselves from slavery in order to comply with kind of Roman directives. But ultimately, rather than freeing the individuals they held in slavery, they chose to sell them to plantations in Louisiana. So that's kind of where the troubling part of the story, that we wish that they had been better individuals and had been able to really to offer kind of a more sort of hopeful example of a sort of Christian practice and had freed the slaves.
Thank you.
There's a couple of comments in the chat box. One of them is, what's being taught today in our Catholic high schools about history? Has the narrative changed? Do you know, Tom?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm sort of removed from a Catholic high school education, being in the university setting. It does take time for these narratives to filter down. I think some of the stories certainly do show up in Catholic texts, especially sort of within Catholic high schools, where it's not just where Catholic history probably isn't encountered in history classes, but in religion classes and theology classes. So the more examples that we have of saintly individuals whether formally recognized by the church or just upheld as saintly individuals, will help correct some of these narratives. So by including the story of the Saintly Six, of Mother Mary Lang, of Pierre Toussaint, of including the stories of Sarah, of including Kateri Tekakwitha. I mean, I think this has been part of the work of the church to expand our catalog of saints. Sort of this goes back to the efforts of Pope John Paul II to promote canonization of a more diverse cast of saintly figures. And that's continued on through to the present day. So I think that's where I would see the hope for these stories taking on new life and starting to take root in high school.
Mm. And we have a comment from Gene Preuss. He says, excellent observations and reading suggestions. I'm a history PhD in Texas, taking formation classes now, and the history texts, where did it go? And the history texts we're assigning really need revision, from constantly referring to Germanic people as barbarians to giving short attention to racism in the U.S. It's really telling. There are good changes, however. Our African American community has monthly history sessions focusing on issues in the church's history, including the 1968 National Black Catholic Clergy Caucus statement. Thanks for that comment, Jean. Tom?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we'll certainly talk about some of the kind of 19th and 20th century examples as we go through these series and call attention to some of the work that Jean was just hinting at there.
Yeah. This is from our archivist at the Sisters of St. Joseph, Virginia. But there were also some unusual stories, like the Healy family members who were accepted into the seminary and rose within the hierarchy and the Jesuit ranks.
Yeah. I had the Healys initially as part of the discussion of Georgetown, and I had to cut them out for time and space. But the Healys were another one of these remarkable families. They passed as white. They were sort of the children of a white father and a light-skinned Black woman. And so they were able to sort of enter religious life, but their mixed racial identity was not known. It was sort of a well-kept secret, although people had their suspicions and might have sort of analyzed facial features and things like that. But one of the Healys becomes the president of Georgetown. He becomes a Jesuit. Another Healy becomes the bishop of Portland, Maine, if I'm remembering correctly. So you have sort of these stories of kind of the first Black Catholics, but sometimes their identity as Black Catholics was not known. And especially sort of telling that story during the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s was kind of a dangerous memory. And so it was actively suppressed. And then it's only more recently when these stories come out. And I think that is part of the work of being more faithful to our past.
Mm. Anyone else? Question, put your hand up if you'd like. I have a question for you, Tom. More recently, even in my own congregation, people have begun to talk about works of restitution, what we can do. For congregations, religious congregations, or for white folks in general who say, well, I didn't have any slaves. We didn't have any slaves in Brentwood. How do you begin to, and maybe you haven't thought about this, but if you could, how do you begin to talk about the responsibility for restitution among white people who feel that they're not complicit in any of this? I mean, is there ever a time when you can say we're not complicit?
Mm-hmm.
Even using the example of my own congregation, we're not complicit in having slaves, and we didn't exploit, I don't think, Black people, but by the same token, we were kind of passive racists. And does passive racism also merit some forms of repentance and restitution.
Mhm. I mean, that's certainly one of the discussions that's out there. And one way to think about it, if historians have noted that sort of slavery is America's original sin. So if you kind of want to take a theological approach, this is sort of part of the original sin that we all bear. Whether we were directly involved, implicated, whether our ancestors were, but it carries on through the Catholic Church today. And so kind of individuals, may not have a personal connection or family history, but we are served by, we are part of institutions that have this as part of their legacy. And so sort of schools, in terms of Georgetown, that profited off of slavery, have now made it a point to offer scholarships to the descendants of those enslaved individuals. In what ways do we have to be sort of more proactive in atoning for those sins? It's not simply a sort of handing out money in terms of kind of a financial settlement, but it's much more about this role of reconciling ourselves with that part of our history as an American Catholic community. So even if somebody sort of says, well, I shouldn't have to pay for this, it's still about recognizing how the church that we are part of has been shaped by that. So at least admitting that story.
Tom, somebody wrote in the question box, can you say something about Bishop Carroll and his family and their influence?
Yeah, sort of Bishop Carroll is sort of a really wonderful and important figure in American Catholic history as the first bishop of the United States. And his family was connected to those original sort of Jesuit missions and plantations. Carroll himself was a Jesuit. And so when he became Bishop of the United States, this is part of Swarnes's book, that he himself had been shaped by and benefited from that history of Jesuit slaveholding. But Carroll also, kind of as a side story from this history of slavery, he's a very important part of the early American story because he helps to bring kind of a particular American character. And with that, sort of, he's accepting of, as somebody who was born in the colonies, grew up with the United States, he embraces an American identity alongside his Catholic identity. So he wants to see things like the use of the vernacular in prayer and worship. And we're going to come back to him in a later session when we sort of talk about kind of the Americanism that takes root in the church in the United States in a way that sort of helps shape our history as different from Europe, which is kind of a shift from kind of the Spanish or the French who come in and want to recreate European Catholicism in the United States. Carroll recognizes that the Catholic Church is going to function in a different way when it's within a Protestant majority nation with the separation of church and state. So he, as the first bishop of the United States, has to negotiate all of those early developments. And he's perhaps rightly credited as sort of being the founding father of the Catholic Church in the United States because he's helping shape a vision for what a American Catholicism would be after the American Revolution.
And somebody added this comment. Cyprian Davis, OBS, wrote a more recent book on Black Catholic history. He was one of the major scholarly presenters at the Black Catholic Institute at Xavier University in New Orleans, the only Black Catholic Institute of Higher Ed founded by the Sisters of Providence.
Yes, so Xavier University Institute for Black Catholic Studies has done remarkable work, has been sort of a incubator, nurturer of historical study, pastoral ministry for Black Catholics in the United States. And they continue to run a summer institute to train parish ministers, amateur historians, and others. And Father Cyprian Davis was a remarkable figure. He himself was sort of a Black vocation, joined the Benedictines, and he originally started studying medieval Europe, kind of the history of the Benedictines back in the Middle Ages. But there was something about his sort of Benedictine love of study that got him interested in sources, the Benedictines, monasteries, manuscripts. And he decided that we needed to have the manuscripts on the Black Catholic experience in the United States. And so he made it his life mission to gather up all of that material. He died a few years ago. I can't remember the exact year of his death. But he had published a book on the kind of the Black Catholic experience in the United States. And currently there is a professor at the University of Dayton, Cecilia Moore, who's also affiliated with the Institute for Black Catholic Studies at Xavier University, who is working to update and put out a new edition of Father Davis's History of Black Catholics in the United States. So hopefully we will be gifted with that in the near future. But it was remarkable that he sort of went and had to sort of search out documents, sort of trace references to Black Catholic communities scattered in diocesan archives, parish vaults, religious community records. Until he gathered all of those materials together, people simply didn't know that history existed. And so kind of we as scholars are indebted to the archivists. And one of the reasons that these stories come out is that the Catholic Church has been very good at maintaining records and archives so that we have this institutional repository that we're able to revisit.
Wonderful. Anyone else? Well, it's almost closing time. I want to thank you, Tom. I can say I will go to bed tonight a little less ignorant than I was when we started this evening. I am most grateful to you. I know we're going to look forward to coming back again. And as we try to do every week, especially given the state of our world, just say, take a moment of quiet to be mindful of all the people who are going to bed very frightened tonight about their status and about what may happen to them and their families, and to ask God in His mercy to send wisdom and light, compassion and mercy into the hearts of all of those people making decisions in our country that are going to affect people's lives, tear families apart, ruin dreams, and send people back marching thousands of miles. So we join in this prayer for all of these people. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. See you next week, Tom. Thanks so much. Good night, everybody.
Wonderful.
See you next week. Bye.
Good night.